It's a pleasure to have you here. Can I ask you to
Good to be
just say
back.
a few words about yourself and your career, please?
Yeah, I'm Dominic Barton. I'm a student of leadership. That's all I would say.
I love that. I love that. Lifelong learner,
Yeah,
and a fantastic career, both before and also now. Dom, we've been talking about the future boardroom and the transformation of both businesses, but also therefore the transformation of boardrooms. What can we do? What can leaders, board members do to keep pace? And of course, chairs as well.
yeah. Well, I think first of all, we have to understand our context. As I said, I think leadership doesn't happen without understanding the context, and different contexts require different types of leadership. And the context I think about a lot here is the climate transition or the energy transition. And we are, in the midst of it, and we are way behind. We're way off track. It's for all the Paris talk of what we would have done by 2030, let alone 2050, we are way off track. And I would actually argue because of wars, conflicts, the fact that I think we didn't take into account that there's 4 to 5 billion new middle class people coming into the system that want to live like the prosperous developed world and will therefore consume more carbon. The demand for energy is going up, so we're trying to at the same time convert from fossil fuels to renewables. We're doing it while we're increasing the demand for energy, and so I think that just makes it more challenging. And I think as corporates, all of us have to have a long-term view of that. And my view is stay the course. There's a lot of backpedaling, I would argue, even in the time I've been in this role at Rio. When I think about the messaging I was getting 2.5 years ago to what I'm getting now, it's just less pressure. It's almost like just be careful about how much money you actually spend on that. It's there's just less. There's definitely less pressure, and a more of a concern of you got to deal with the returns, and there's a lot of issues coming on. So, with all that context in mind, I especially to speak for on the Rio side, but I think it relates to other large organizations. If you think long term, we have to do our part, and there's a way to do it and benefit the shareholder. This isn't at the cost of the shareholder. It's a win-win-win, or it's all cohesive. And so we've set targets that we want to make by 2030 and by 2050 on our decarbonization, and we're going to make them. We're going to do it, and we have to realize the technology is changing. I mean, people's views of hydrogen 3 years ago versus today are quite different. There's new technologies that are coming out that are very exciting, and I would even put in that category. You might think I'm a nutter, but nuclear fusion. I mean, so there's technology which is great, but only 10% of, if I could bucket it, of that new technology is being commercialized. So there's a lot of good ideas, but not a lot of it's there. So anyhow, long-winded way of saying, I think we have targets that we need to hit, and we got to drive it and deliver it. And if you don't have pressure and a sort of a target, I don't think no one's going to get there. So corporates can do a lot, and so we're very driven by that. It's totally linked to our strategy, right? If I just think about it again, and this is just a small example. I think all companies need to think this way, but we are focused on the materials that will help with the energy transition. We're not doing diamonds. We're not. We want to focus on those materials that are needed, and we want to do it in a way that doesn't generate carbon as well as we kind of go through it, but do it at a pace that is doable. And that's there's a lot of capital that we're putting into that. There's a lot of cooperation that we're having with many different companies and countries, academics, venture capital, because again, there's no one has a clear solution, other than it's just getting more and more urgent. That's our sort of sense.
And I couldn't agree more that it gets more and more urgent. But I also hear you saying, well, we're seeing, perhaps not so much pressure, perhaps some backpedaling. We are in a year with elections. We are in a year with a lot of ESG backlash, DEI backlash, a lot of different positions, different
Yeah,
places in the world. At the same time, we also, where if we look outside and we see Mother Nature, it seems like Mother Nature keeps sending us invoices.
yeah,
And so how, that, you have the pressure from Mother Nature, perhaps, but you
yeah.
don't have the necessarily the pressure from the political. Uh,
No,
or what do you see? I mean, all of the elections that we have this year.
yeah. Well, I think we clearly have to think about what the implications. I think the biggest one is the U.S. one. That's frankly the biggest factor. What will happen to the IRA? What will happen to just the kind of the push or drive on decarbonization? How will it, how I think that has a big effect, and it has a big effect for everyone. I think it's actually countries outside of the US that will be affected more than the US in terms of that. And so we have to think about it, and we have to think about scenarios of what that means. I think for us, there's no scenario where we're not doing anything. Like, we have to keep driving. It's just how you do it. It's going to not the what so much as the how. And one of the challenges in this mix, right, is that while this is going on, China is probably doing the most of any country in terms of the decarbonization. What they're doing on the renewable side is just extraordinary. It's on a number, as different categories. They're more than 50% of the world's new installed base. Electric vehicles, we've seen what's happening on that front, and with kind of more trade wars and tariffs, that's going to make it harder. And we actually are searching the world for the best technology and the best capability to be able to help us with the decarb, right? Because we can't spend a fortune. It has to work. So I think that, again, rather than whine about it, I just think we have to think about scenarios of how we do it, where we do it, how we partner with different people. But I think there's a role for business to kind of to keep pushing, because it actually will make sense long term. And the other part I would just say is, sadly, these invoices, as you said, that we're getting from Mother Nature, or signals, are unfortunately hitting the people that are the poorest, the ones that aren't actually doing anything. If you think about what's happening in Southeast Asia, you think about the rising water levels, you think about the drought, you think about what that does to agriculture, famine, all of that type of thing. It's very unfortunate that in terms of how where it's affecting it. And again, in Florida, obviously, you're going to feel. I do think we're seeing the impact. People will see it, but when we think about that, we should think about that as happening in other parts of the world where there isn't the media talking about things, and it's going to then lead to other consequences, which are, because everything's connected. Migration. People don't have food, they move. That I think it's climate change that drove the immigration crisis in Europe. That's what started it. So this is like a fundamental issue to the stability of our society, I think, and that's another reason why I think as business, you better don't assume it's going to be taken care of. So I think it's going to be a very difficult, volatile period to make decisions in and drive things forward in.
And I think that goes back to where you started, leadership. I mean, we're talking now about just transition, but
Yeah,
you're talking about just transition in a world that seems to be looking more at, the old shell scenarios and bound the scenario, right? Let's make sure we keep everything. So if we look at it from the leadership perspective, how would you say we structure and govern in a very different and let's say, fast-paced world where some will say, well, let's just take care of our own, and others are saying, well, we do need, as you're saying, to look at a, call it just transition in order to not have those big societal issues that clearly will hit businesses
Yeah.
as well.
Well, it's a hugely challenging question you're putting forward, right? I mean, and I think it's because because so many of the variables are not determined, if I could call it. They're not fixed. They're all over the place. And I even think it gets down to social capital, like the premises on which what we think is reasonable or right or just. There's even debate about that. Like we're all, so it's actually, you can have a very dark view of that it's just getting more splintered, more short term, more selfish, more, on the other hand, I think we kind of, the world moves in cycles, and we sort of are able to, things will shift back. And I think, again, we shouldn't, for leadership, I think means you take ownership. That's an important part of it. And so do what you possibly can to try and fix that context. And it may seem, in some cases, like it may be outside of your wheelhouse, but you need to be thinking, you need to be thinking about that for the stability of the system. It's interesting here, just being in the UK, I think what most business people are actually yearning for is just stability. That's all they want, just stability. But policy making has become more complicated because you have to, we need, a lot of countries, you've mentioned the elections, a lot of incumbents are being thrown out. There's a lot of debt that has to be accounted for. The United States is probably the only country that can kind of continue to spend and do that because they have the dollar and so forth. But I don't know if that I don't think it'll last forever, but it's going to last a lot longer than for anyone else. So you're seeing cuts in government expenditure. You're seeing rising taxes, and that all is negative. You know what I mean? It doesn't excite business to hear that. It doesn't excite people. You know what I mean? And so we've got some very tricky policy challenges, and that's where I think there has to be more thinking. And again, corporates may not do this, but to support how do we think about a new frame of policy over the next 5 to 10 years, given all of these challenges, the just transition, the energy transition, conflict, splits within society. What I think we actually going to need some new thinking on that, and we should be supporting the thinking about that. We should be about how to get more cohesion or context to be able to move things forward. And it may not seem like it's direct impact, but I think it's going to be important to make the changes that we're moving forward, because as we become more fractured with less social capital, with bigger and bigger issues, I inevitably think that leads to conflict, and that's the worst outcome. But I feel like that's where we're heading. It's like we're all in a river floating along. We know that there's a waterfall coming sometime down the corner, but we're all kind of trying to get into a different part of the stream, but it's all heading in one way. And I think we just got to be able to step back and figure out how we're going to try and build it. And that's it's a challenge.
Who are those leaders that needs to kind of say, okay, let's put our heads a little bit higher and actually talk about what we can do, and not have antitrust, all of those different things, but really, what does good global governance almost look like?
Yeah, well, I think the leaders are out there, but it may not be the existing leaders, because there's amazing existing leaders. But there's a notion that I think there needs to be some rethinking. So, for example, it's ironic, but it's the 80th anniversary of the IMF and the World Bank right now. Those are very important institutions, but they're 80 years old now. How much have they changed over an 80-year period? What are they? And I think those are extremely important institutions, and I thank God that we have them, because they have helped on many, many dimensions. But it probably needs to be modernized for the next, let's say, at least say 20 years. What is that going to look like? How's the system going to be? And so I think it's important to the thinking that there's people writing, and it can either be people who have been in the system but are out of the system that maybe are writing about this type of thing. Someone like Mark Malloch Brown is a guy I have a lot of respect for. Right, he's been in very many different roles. He's older, like that. But I'd also be looking for younger 35 to 40-year-olds in university just thinking about the system. And we've got, I haven't even talked about technology, let alone the AI, the interesting things on the AI front and how quickly that vector is moving, let alone the energy. So I think we need a like a post-war summit without having a war, if you will, to say, what do we want that to look like? And it's probably not the incumbents that are the ones that will have the credibility to do that. So I think this is where we need to be encouraging people to be writing and thinking, because I think it's insights. They're out there. I think I'm as I said, I'm saying all of this stuff that sounds bad. As I'm a frightened optimist. I'm actually optimistic. I just think it's going to take a lot of work. And I think we need to put some resources in areas that may seem not as direct impact as they are, but they'll long-term be that way.
So if we look at the optimistic part of this and going back kind of like around the boardroom table and that future board table, what will outstanding governance look like?
Well, I think again, there's so many different elements of that, right? But besides the basics of the oversight and all of that, which I think is we should just assume. I know that that's a big thing to say, but I think it is this kind of. I think it's thinking about it's having more of a long-term view. How do we? I think good governance are people that are thinking in 10 to 20-year timeframes, not quarterly to 3-year timeframes, and that's hard in a book. But so that is a very important part, I think, of that. I think the second is on capital allocation, and it's not so much about what you're putting between projects or organic or inorganic. Again, it's about future building versus cash generating, and how do you make the right trade-offs on that front and keep your shareholder satisfied in terms of where those are tricky when you get, because it's again related to the long term. And I think it's really on people. It's like leadership, so obviously succession, we know that that's critically important, but just what is the leadership model that is required in your organization to be successful for the next 10 to 20 years? So those are, to me, 3 areas that I think are pretty fundamental, besides the basics, right, of the kind of the oversight. How can you be long term? How do you think about capital allocation in that context, and how do you focus on developing the leaders that are going to be needed for the kind of the world we're moving into, leadership development?
And I think that also gets to then the communication with the market, being that shareholders to future shareholders, but also internally in the company. What does good look like, and what are we looking for? In a leader.
No, you're right. I think I actually think that role you make, communications is so important, and I think we've underplayed it for a long period. It's kind of like, well, PR or the corporate, it's with the way, again, because of this breakdown in social capital, how messages get sent or perceived, how the fractionation, if you will, again, of media. You mentioned the other one, the internal within your organization. People, it's so different than it was 10 years ago, right? In terms of expectations of what people on political issues, all of the two you took, DI, everything, ESG, diversity, inclusive, it's so that I think we're way behind on that front, how we communicate what we're trying to do with the market, but also with your organization and with stakeholders.